Gebhard's career is all about growth, courage, and adaptability. She started out in supply chain more than 20 years ago and worked all the way up at Amazon, taking on big leadership roles in areas like books, video games, and fashion. Recently, she shifted her focus to diversity, equity, and inclusion, where she used her experience to help create workplaces that are fair and welcoming for everyone. But Liz's story is about more than just work. A serious health issue also gave her a new perspective on balancing work and life, and inspired her to focus on making a difference for those coming after her. In this episode, Liz shares the defining moments of her career, the insights gained from stepping outside her comfort zone, and how setbacks became catalysts for growth. This is a conversation about stepping up to make a change, leading with purpose, and discovering what's truly possible when you bet on yourself.
If something felt like I had done it a number of times and it was becoming easy, to me, that was always a signal of, is it time for the next challenge? Like I'm not a static person in much of anything. So I like to keep moving and keep moving forward. Am I repeating this for the fourth cycle? Am I learning something new this cycle? Have I done something different? To move up, you also need to be willing to move across and learn different functional skills, learn different ways to approach a problem, because the more ways and the more views you have on a problem set, the better you're going to be in helping make faster decisions.
Hello, Liz. I'm very pleased to have you. Haven't mentioned to our listeners, but I've actually known you for, what is it now, close to 10 years. So you're part of the category inspiring role models, but also good friends that I met in London. And I thought that maybe we'll start a little bit with an introduction of who you are, because I must admit, as I was preparing for this podcast episode, as I always do, I looked at your profile on LinkedIn and I started scrolling down, and there was a lot of scrolling and a lot of roles. And I had to go all the way back down to what was probably about 20 years of experience. And it seems like you've done so many different things, from video games, fashion, music and movies, technology, just anything commercial. You pretty much sold it. But how did it all start?
About 20 plus years ago. And I started on supply chain, which is something I'd never studied, never officially had interest in, before, and just became obsessed with it. It was such a great opportunity to really understand the inner workings of how to really make things happen. It was in early days. So we were, I think, of a team of about 20 running this little startup business for Target.
So when you say early days, that was the early 2000s.
Yeah. 2004. And interestingly enough, in my longer term journey, the back end of that at the time was Amazon. But started in supply chain as an analyst, moved up the ranks. And after 9 years effectively working for Amazon on the back end, and having been kind of tapped or reached out to a number of times, eventually decided to make the move to Amazon. So that was about 9 years into my corporate career. Moved to Seattle, got started in books, which I thought, hey, this is a great place to learn from the original business.
Yes, that's what Amazon was back in the day. I remember when I first heard of Amazon, that was 2007. I was in uni, and it was pretty much a bookshop and a place where you get things to study, to help you study.
Yeah. And to my surprise, I thought I'd join and everything would be working, and it was sort of a well-run machine, but it was still a center of innovation. So a huge amount of my time there was building out our comic book business, building out our relationships with publishers. So again, kind of always found my space in these, where's the innovation opportunity? And during that time, when I was making the move to Amazon, one of my biggest considerations was I'd always really wanted to have an experience working abroad. So I moved over to UK in 2015, not really with a plan of how long I would stay, just sort of as a fun.
How long has it been now?
It's been 9 years.
There you go, and counting. Well, we'll get to that point, but yeah, you're still in London, but a few things have changed.
Yeah. So again, jumped into commercial aspect. And throughout that time, I'd really still loved the commercial roles, but I'd gone to a training and heard about this really cool role. At the time, it was called technical advisor, but effectively kind of chief of staff, chief operating officer type role within the business. And came back from this training, and about 3 weeks later, there was a role posted for a role within our fashion organization. So went from leading a UK business to stepping in as the technical advisor for our fashion European business, which at the time was going through a big transformation. So I guess my signal so far in my career was that I really just love tough problems and the ability to solve with technology and innovation. So that was always my kind of driving piece.
Yeah, that was, I was going to ask you. So what is the common theme, or obviously you've switched roles, and many of our listeners may not know necessarily how it all works on the back end. They only see the nice shopping website experience. But what was it, the desire to build, as you said, to solve problems? Was there something else as well that kept you moving through these ranks internally?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things that were really always clear to me is that the problem solving really comes from an inherent, I'm a lifelong learner. So I thrive on opportunities to kind of push myself to be able to learn and think differently, in particular, learn from new people and really have to solve problems in totally different industries. So the learning aspect was one big part. And then the second is I was so excited about customers and the different experiences they had and the problems they were facing. And I think just having time spent in understanding what customers were, but really starting to get a sense of what that felt like. And then I think the third piece was a thread of I just really loved learning from really interesting people and people that I was inspired by and interested in. So I really kind of mixed between following great leaders, that learning aspect, and then also just really hard problems.
Yeah, and this is what we were talking about just before recording this. How do you know, even if it's internal when you're still staying in the same organization, how do you know it's time to move roles, and how do you make sure that what you're doing is not just following people? Because the reality of it is, even if you're like a leader, they could be gone tomorrow. So sometimes that's not the best strategy. So how did you weigh these opportunities when you were deciding what to do next?
Yeah, so I think the inflection point is always different for different people. I think mine was always if something felt like I had done it a number of times and it was becoming easy, to me that was always a signal of, is it time for the next challenge? Like I'm not a static person in much of anything, so I like to keep moving and keep moving forward. So that was one aspect I think for me was where I'd reach a precipice of, am I repeating this for the fourth cycle? Am I learning something new this cycle? Have I done something different? And then I think the understanding of, I've never really believed in a career that follows role A to role Z is how you get from top to bottom or moving yourself forward. And I think to move up, you also need to be willing to move across and learn different functional skills, learn different ways to approach a problem, because the more ways and the more views you have on a problem set, the better you're going to be in helping make faster decisions, but also just at the end, be more effective in what you want to drive. And really, a lot of times taking a much further step away from what I was really comfortable with. And if I knew a new role was, 5 things different about it, I would try to lean into, okay, I could bring these 2 things with, but I'm going to learn these 5 new things.
Yeah, and that's a good way to think about it, because we know that women are less likely to put themselves forward for new roles unless they feel that they tick every box. I used to think that's a bit of a generalization, but I think that's probably true. And what's interesting that you've not only had business experience, understanding and learning about the business and building new solutions, but you've also had experience as a manager as well, leading big teams. Surely there must have been some challenging decisions to make. And I almost wonder which one you were more proud of, leading and mentoring people, building the business. Was there ever a role that you felt, okay, that's it. That's the thing that I'm probably the proudest of when it comes to my time spent in the commercial business?
It's a great question. And I think for me, helping others be successful in career has always been the things that I've been most proud of. It's my favorite things to help other people succeed, but also to be able to see the scale of impact and to have people feel like they've really connected into what the work is and are really motivated to stay and be connected to the mission. So I think from any role that I've had, I will always say my favorites have been those that I've been a team leader. And in particular, I think one of those that was, and one of my most challenging people leader roles was after I'd spent about 18 months as the chief of staff. I was given the opportunity to be considered for a role leading our accessories businesses and our vendor services arm of the business, which was a team of, at the time, about 120. Later had to grow it quite significantly from that, and accepted the job on, I think it was March 16th, 2020. And then moving into what turned out to be then 2.5 years effectively leading completely virtually. And
people you've never met and they've never met you.
Never met me. And the other piece about that is a huge percentage of my team, this was their first roles out of university or maybe their second or third, but quite newer in career. So it's how do you build team culture, team dynamic when it is really isolated, when it is really far apart, and there's a lot going on that you don't know about. So as a leader, normally you'd have a position of, yeah, it's virtual, but at least I know the mission, I know what's going on. No one knew.
They're not
anything.
Yeah, so you not only have the whole world breaking down or grinding to a halt, but you're also given this new role. And on top of it, most of the people there, you're not just teaching them about the business, you're actually teaching them how to have a job because they've never had a job before.
100%. And I think that was also my biggest role, that I was leading a huge layer of leaders. So leader of leader of leaders. So that was my first kind of big organization leadership role, especially pan region. And there was always a bit of me because, as you can tell by my accent, I'm American. So I have moved over. I always felt a little bit sometimes like an imposter in those scenarios, being like, here's the American coming to fix this thing, and becoming in that sense, especially with European culture. So I think a big learning I had was really making sure to spend time with people and leading with emotional intelligence, leading as exclusively as you could, acknowledging people were going through so many different things, but it really actually tapped into something I'd always thought I was really good at, but hadn't really necessarily had the chance to be recognized for it. And I think organizationally, that shifted a lot of minds in terms of like that skill set as a leader being much more important at times than being able to drill the commercial result. So I think a lot of what I learned in that is certainly how to manage businesses really during complex, crazy times. But then at the same time, I was scaling that team. So I really had to be thinking about not just my teams in Europe, but how was that affecting in other regions and what was happening. So different markets, different perspectives. And it really just kind of accelerated what would have probably taken me longer to learn within that period of time.
It was a good opportunity at the right time that allowed you to combine your skills. And there was certainly probably a desire that was building up for a long time to get that opportunity, to be given that opportunity. But I also know that navigating the corporate world, especially when it comes to managing such a huge number of people, there's deliverables, there's expectations, there are many, many, many stakeholders involved, especially at some of these massive corporations. And we still know it's a very male-dominated world for the most part. So I'm curious whether you've had any experiences or times when you felt that that was challenging, that maybe being the only woman in a room. And I remember actually you used to lead something like video games, and again, a very, very few women tend to go into that space. So I wonder if there was some of the more challenging times when you experienced things that you probably hope don't happen again.
Yeah, it's a great point. And unfortunately, like many people, I have had many experiences of being the only in the room. Is not necessarily a bad thing to start with, but it's making sure that you leave the door open for others. So I'll talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've definitely had instances where being the only meant that you felt a different responsibility to both represent, but also speak up for those voices that might not be in the room. So in my earlier career, unfortunately, had many times when I was traveling or in different circumstances that I was put in situations that I was pretty uncomfortable, whether it was traveling with mostly male peers and ending up in situations that, an after thing or anything like that, that I ended up feeling like a little bit like, I need to make sure.
Yeah, and it wasn't even the company itself. It sounds like you go to these conferences where there are vendors or whoever it may be, relationships that people that you work with in the company. And we all know there's always a blurred line between work and those entertainment.
And I think it wasn't just the gender aspect, it was age aspect and other things as well. So when I was, successful younger, I was, often in the room and I was probably the younger member of the team. So I'd get the kind of, the tasks to me or something like that. People wouldn't believe that I was the leader in that space and that stuff. And then as I got more senior, it was still this piece of I was often the only woman in the room in the leadership position. I might have had a much more gender balanced team underneath that. But in particular, it was interesting to transition between something like video games and fashion. There is a huge percentage of women in fashion. But what you see is sort of when I started to recognize the funnel issue. So it's not necessarily a funnel at the top. There's more than 50% often women coming in the fashion side. But if you go further up the leadership chain down that funnel, there is very much, you see the broken rung. So it's not, the glass ceiling. It's really this, how do you get stepped up to that first real opportunity to prove yourself and be in the bigger seat. So you'll see a ton of women in marketing, a ton of women in buying, a ton of women in these spaces, but not as many in operations, not as many in technology, not as many in. So it's sort of, how do you make sure you take your opportunities to look at the data, set clear targets, making sure that you're finding those gaps and addressing them. The fashion industry is very sizist and there's still a lot of issues in that. So it gave me a good sense of gender might not be the first topic here. Maybe it's disability, maybe it's representation of different how people look. And ultimately as well, the real opportunity to show that that's a business benefit. If you show what clothes look like on different sized people, they're less likely to return it, which is a huge cost in fashion to kind of have a high return rate. So as you can imagine, as I mentioned throughout my career, I was in technology, I was in supply chain, I was in a lot of male-dominated spaces. So as a woman, I was representing every woman, not just myself and my perspective. So it was a good opportunity to really lean into what as a business leader I could bring to the table and bring the voice of DEI from a commercial perspective. So it was a real transition for me in that sense as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like this was probably the beginning of when you started to think about representation, diversity, and it, I can see and I know because I've known you personally as well how much you care about that, and that was probably the role that you got to in the end towards the end of your career at Amazon, and we'll get to that. But I also really, you made me think about two things. One is about the responsibility that you also have leading your team. And I know that you've shared with me in the past that there were times when you felt that there were certain behaviors, let's say from external vendors or suppliers, that you just wouldn't tolerate being displayed towards your team. But then I know that sometimes that's quite a hard thing to do. And there's always that tendency that we've talked about not rocking the boat and not causing too much trouble. So how do you find the balance, whether it's something that happened to you personally or perhaps to somebody in the team?
Yeah. So I think the couple instances, or the couple things that are most important thinking about your role as a leader differently in that space is, first of all, you need to have a safe space where your team and people are even willing to come to you to share their experiences. So fundamentally, I think it's making yourself available, being vulnerable, showing those different aspects and making sure to kind of create that environment. I think because I was a woman, I had more people coming to me than might have a man. But I also, in that role, had a phenomenal male ally as a leader. So I really lent into the space of when individuals would come or had have disruption, and not just in this space, but in other roles as well. It was really making sure my team felt comfortable. And then it's also, you mentioned the responsibility piece. I think it felt like a very different time, Me Too and things like that had happened. So it did feel generally like a much more safe space to have opportunities to kind of raise and say, hey, this isn't going to be acceptable. We need to kind of change tact on it. I'd seen that role model a few times earlier in my career, but I don't think until I was a leader that I feel like I had the right voice to be able to say I'm not going to bring anybody else's name into this, but I will absolutely make sure that it's being addressed and presented as something that needs to be taken care of. But also making sure that you're not using it as an opportunity to kind of finger point. Right? The aim of that is not to make someone else feel shamed or things. It's really trying to make sure that people are just aware. Like a lot of it came down to just awareness.
Yeah. And I know that also when you were, just as you were doing that role, there was a lot going on. And we mentioned COVID and we mentioned that the world came to a freeze. But what our listeners may not know is that you also had during COVID quite a significant personal health crisis. And I have a feeling that also played a part in you deciding to shift gears and ultimately to switch your role.
Yeah, happy to discuss that. The background I had been starting to think about, I'd reached some of those precipice points of, hey, I did this great thing. I'm learning a lot, but I want to think about what's my next adventure. And I've been looking across a number of different roles and opportunities. And it was sort of this combination of, unfortunately, the events that happened in Minnesota, where I'm actually from, to George Floyd had accelerated a lot of conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion in corporations. But what really was my trigger point to your call out was I ended up contracting COVID. I was double vaccinated, but I've had lifelong lung issues. So I ended up in ICU in the UK for about 12 days in hospital and was nearly on a ventilator. Was really close to, as close as I had come to really life-threatening illness. And my team at work was incredibly supportive, but it was a really important moment for me to really, think about that health aspect, my mental health, my physical health, and being away from family and super isolated was super hard. But it was a really important point for me to think about, okay, this feels like a time that if I really want to take a big swing and think totally differently about my career and what I want to spend time on, just sort of in time with that unfortunate illness, there was an opportunity to switch gears and to move out of commercial officially as leadership and move to lead diversity, equity, and inclusion on a global level.
But how did that actually happen? Was it something that was offered to you? Did you actually go out actively there to start looking for that role because you had something in the back of your mind, that voice suggesting, well, this is what I should really focus on?
So it was a bit of again, I'd kind of been in a lot of those spaces. So I had started really serving on some of the councils from a business leader perspective several years before, and was at the time on a European Council of Business Leaders supporting that agenda before we had a bunch of teams behind it, but I was sort of already a business sponsor of the topic. So I was in the thought process of leaders because I was in the room a lot. And at the time, they were finally starting to create teams and opportunities. So it was a bit of that aspect of they created the opportunity. I'd seen it, but I was also kind of in the room a lot, and I knew that they were kind of heading towards that direction. So I was kind of able to do a bit of push-pull of, hey, I'm putting my hat in the ring, even though it's human resources and I'm a commercial person. So I don't have the official background from a degree perspective, but hey, I understand how the organization works. I understand how teams operate. I have been operating outside the US for, at the time then, 6 years. So I had a perspective of how other teams were operating. So it was sort of a way that I was able to position my skills and my ability to take on that next challenge and be supported for that as well.
And this is an important reminder that sometimes it's not just about the degrees and necessarily the previous experience, of course, but yeah, we should be thinking a bit more broadly, I suppose, when we think about new roles, because I think I've seen many of my peers constrain themselves with, oh, but I haven't done this and I haven't really worked in, let's say, with people as people partner. How can I be? And oftentimes you'll find that organizations are actually quite susceptible or open rather to such changes.
Yeah, I think, I think the statistic, and I've heard different percentages, but, a woman will look at a job description. If she doesn't meet 75% of it, she won't even bother applying. Man looks at the same, meets 25% apply. So it is important, to your point, when you're looking at something like a job description, first of all, acknowledging that a job description is probably existing as it is for about 30 seconds. And then once you're finally in the seat, no matter if internal or external, is that job is changing and it's going to evolve. So that's a static point in time of what that piece of paper says. But it is being able to kind of step out of it, think differently about your skills. So, hey, I've not led this, but I've influenced commercially these kind of outcomes. Therefore, I could take that skill and influence internally for policies and process. So it does take a lot of courage to think differently about that. But I also, one of the things that's been most important to me in my longer career is I've made those, to some degree, pretty big changes. I've kind of built up my own my own personal board of advisors, I guess, of really trusted mentors and former leaders, friends, family that I would go to.
The kitchen table, as Michelle Obama calls it, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. My kitchen table aspect of it. So they have been really important in helping me think through. And I try to approach everything as this is not, it's not a one-way door. Like I can come back. I still have these relationships. I'm still a commercial leader.
Yeah. And you always have these backup options. And I think that's what your advisors would probably have said at the time. Well, the reality is you should, especially if you're making a slightly bolder move or moving into something that you haven't really done before, just make sure that you have something to fall back on. And I think that is an important safety net to have there so that you're not just recklessly jumping into something that you have no understanding of. But I also like, and I picked up on something that you said about the job descriptions, and you said, well, that's the role just for the first 30 seconds. And then once you dig deeper, you may find that it changes. And I actually know of a friend who recently started a new role. And I remember that the same recruiter approached me because we work in the same industry. And I know what the role was when they were initially approaching people. And I know that in the end, it ended up being a completely new role because she saw the opportunity. She thought, well, they're saying they're looking for A, but actually knowing them and using my experience, I think they need B. And B is actually where I want to be. So let's have this discussion and see how it goes. And I think that's just amazing. And I feel like we don't do enough of this.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I think one of the biggest reasons for that not being static is that it is based on the individual. Like companies make a hiring decision, but then they learn about, hey, we hired you for this. We didn't know you also had these 3 other skills. So we're willing to add this if that's part of something you're interested in. And I think going back to how you make decisions on it, it's really important to be clear on your why. Why am I making this change? Why is this something that's the right time? Those aspects. But it's also having a clear list of non-negotiables. So debating between roles, it makes it a lot easier to say, hey, I know that things to be true for me now, no matter what I do, is I need to be a people leader because I thrive in an environment where I'm supporting and building and growing teams. I need to be in an environment where I'm solving tough problems. It's important to me now to think globally or regionally. I think it's sort of, as you get further in your career, that list might change. And also make sure you're talking about your experience when you're approaching a role like that, because it is a sell job. I don't have this on my CV, but I do have these other 5 things that actually translate. So ignore that aspect of it. So that part of networking is super important because people will only read the paper. You need to make sure they understand the person.
Yeah, it's a bit like looking for a house, to borrow a metaphor. I think I heard that on a different podcast, which is called Squiggly Careers, which, by the way, is a fantastic podcast. But it was all about, you always have a non-negotiable list. So you should really focus on the things that are important. Don't get too distracted by something that they're trying to offer you or sell you. But I wanted to take you a step back. The that D&I role that you eventually landed at Amazon. So that was obviously after COVID, kind of towards the end of the COVID period. And as you said, it was a historical point in time for many of us, just opening our eyes to the realities of the world. And so there you are, you end up this new role. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think that role didn't exist before. So once again, Liz was building something from scratch. Surprise, surprise. But there was something about it. I knew once you got that role that you were just so passionate and enthusiastic about it. And even now when you're talking, you keep smiling, just explaining why you did this and why it mattered to you. And I really want you to tell our listeners about what that role actually entailed, because I know you were covering that for a global corporation that operates across multiple markets. And our idea of diversity, as you said, or even equity could be completely different depending on who you're speaking to and who your employees are.
Yeah. So, similar to other opportunities, so I started out as the European leader and then was quickly given remit over the broader international team. So it was sort of, how do we build processes to help us get to representation faster? So it was a lot of that building phase you mentioned, and also building the organization from scratch. So it was a lot of hiring. It was a lot of, particularly for me in that space, it was really important. I hired people that were totally different to me. I could bring part of that background, but I needed deep experts in regions. I needed people that had come from formal HR roles and DEI, external experts. But a big part of it was building out the agenda that was going to be common across the world. But then what were those really specific things that needed to be true in regions? Because the starting point is different. And you and I have talked about this a little bit in other conversations, but the aspect of thinking globally. So how do you apply a similar initiative or focus at a global level, but make sure your starting point and how you're thinking about this quite local?
Yeah, it was when you started traveling, it was interesting for me to hear some of those stories, because I think when people think of Amazon or any big corporation out there, they always think about the people that, or even in different organizations or different markets, people always think about offices and people sitting in offices and diversity as being the office workers. But then there's so much beyond that, as you say, and not all of Amazon employees are office workers. It's quite a different business that reaches, as you say, very deep in different parts of the population. So I think you had two that I found very interesting. One was in India, and the other one was, I believe it might have been Australia, and again, in relation to some of the indigenous people there. And I think that to me was just some groundbreaking revelations, if you will.
Yeah. So the two that we had spoken about, so being able to travel to India and really experience the culture and the aspect of, I'd worked for so long with teams from India and across so many years of my career, and really being able to go and understand a bit more about the experience was great. And one of the biggest learnings I had, and this wasn't specific to the organization, it was just in general from a culture perspective, but in general, particularly the global South, the challenge wasn't necessarily hiring at the start. It was being able to have people progress in their careers in different ways, because the culture was just different in how they were supporting women, not just having a child, but getting married, and what that experience would be kind of coming back to work after you're married. With person with disabilities, it was just how complicated the system is for parents to be able to get certification, to get services. But then also just the employment rates for person with disabilities was just pretty alarming. So it's finding those opportunities to really understand differently from a cultural perspective, because it's just a different starting. It's not, everybody is not as far along in any conversation than you might be where you're from. And a big aspect of that was just really trying to approach learning from that, from this isn't about me at all. Like, tell me from your lens, and so that I can then take that voice into other rooms. And going to Australia and going to just day-to-day meetings and having land acknowledgements be part of a day-to-day meeting, having Indigenous and First Nations communities be part of all of the considerations we had as an organization, because corporations are held to accountability in Australia differently than other places. And particularly having grown up in the United States, in a state that has a huge Native American population, I was just truly blown away about the responsibility and ownership organizations had taken in that agenda, and that government was holding organizations accountable too, which is completely different in the experience I had in the US. That was primarily government. There wasn't like a huge amount of corporate responsibility in those communities.
Yeah, and that's why I guess it's so important to have these different voices around the table, because as you said, yes, you're a white woman and you represent a certain demographic, but your experience would never be the same as that of a Black woman or somebody from the LGBT community, as much as you like to support them and think that you understand is just not comparable. And I think that's why it's so important to, even sometimes I've seen people who are well-meaning in a corporate environment and think that they want to help. They sort of jump to conclusions without actually having spoken to those groups or having sought the advice of somebody who is a member of that community. So would you say that's one of the big dangers in those roles, and certainly one of the things you experience?
And I think going back to that responsibility piece, I think it's also the perspective of my job is not to go pour back and fix all of that. It's to make sure I'm representing a broader lens when I'm in those conversations, because conversations naturally becomes pretty myopic quickly because you're thinking only the experience of what you know and what you're closest to. And it's really important to have people that are able to challenge and to kind of broaden that perspective. And that's true in business, but it's really important in people conversations and communities, because it's there is no single experience for any individual. But when you bring communities and start to bulk put an experience together, particularly if you're talking about all women, which is 50% of the population globally, no way every woman has the same experience from others. So it was already a good learning, but I just had really phenomenal moments in those opportunities to kind of take different time and to really learn from those communities.
And then, so that was your pretty much the combination, if you will, at your almost 20 plus year career in the commercial side, and more than 10 years with Amazon. So you've now finished, and that's probably the last chapter so far. You've left that job at Amazon, and I know you're looking at other opportunities at the moment. So again, I want to refocus that conversation a little bit as to, maybe what motivated that decision to try something different, and where are you hoping your career takes you, and also how are you hoping to get there? What tools are you using? Because I think that might be helpful to many of our listeners to start building that dream job that probably doesn't exist and you're not recruited for, but you're kind of creating yourself.
I'd been in the organization for 12 years. I had learned such an incredible amount. I had so many phenomenal experiences, but there was that kind of itch of what's next. I'd seen all this kind of interesting stuff and had a lot of mentors that started to build up portfolio career. One of the fundamental pieces that I loved about teams was helping people unlock their potential. So I've started to do volunteer roles or some things like that for being an advisory member on boards, being a mentor to startups and founders. And what I'm energized by in that is that it sort of keeps my problem solving brain and those things excited, but it is still giving me a chance to kind of hop on and out different things. And I think also taking the time to really think about, I've had 20 plus years in multinationals and these kind of big opportunities. The positives about global roles is that you get to learn a ton. The challenges is that it's meaning that you have to really make sure that you are really methodical about managing your time and having work-life balance. And I have such strong ownership over things that I sometimes let kind of blend together. So it was a good opportunity for me to kind of step back on that. I think time is a gift you can only give yourself. So it's also kind of acknowledging that it's an important opportunity for everybody to, if you have the financial means to step back and think differently, then it's an important, time to take a little sabbatical.
Yeah, and I know you said financial means, but it is in a way investment. And this is what I wanted to talk about, because on this show specifically, we talk about that intersection between wellness and well-being and your career and work life. And we often, I say, talk about them as if they're different things, but they're so connected. And if you're not feeling well, you're not going to be able to perform. Nobody can argue with that. And that's why I think it's so important. And thank you for sharing that sometimes there is a price to pay for this kind of climbing up the ladder and working for these big organizations. You do sometimes end up compromising your personal life. And that's why I think it's important to have that vulnerability and also to mention, look, I'm not quite sure. I don't think I've necessarily figured out exactly what the next step is, but I knew that it was the right time to move on. And you don't always have to have it 100% figured out. And hopefully that encourages some of our listeners to think about their roles differently.
Yeah, I think going back to what is that list of when I know something is right, I think the things that have been the biggest payouts for me have been the decisions that I made that scared me the most. When I've really had to jump off the edge. And I love skydiving, I love all those kind of things as well. But when I've really made decisions that made me a little anxious and really had to make me think differently about it, have ultimately been the things that have given me the most reward. And I think ultimately in that jump, regardless of the circumstance, that betting on yourself is the only way forward on that. So I think it's just really important to keep taking stock of, there's always going to be people that have different opinions to you about what decisions you've made. So to really kind of quiet that noise and make sure that you're really understanding that whatever decision you're making, it's ultimately a bet on yourself and knowing that you are absolutely capable and worth taking that bet on, you got to bet on you, because if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? You got to make sure that you're not waiting for the perfect anything, because there's never a perfect time for any decision. There's never a perfect circumstance. And you is the only person you ultimately have accountability to in that.
And yes, and you are the only person that's going to regret it if you didn't take an opportunity when it presented yourself. Liz, you've given us a very nice summary of your story and I suppose the lessons that you've learned. So thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Really, really enjoy this. And I know that you and I will carry on with our conversation over many coffees and dinners. There's something very special about knowing someone for as many years as I've known Liz, and actually then getting the chance to have an interview with her and talk about all the things that really mattered. I've known her for more than 10 years, and it's just been fantastic to see how she's evolved over the years, and hopefully I have too, as a friend along the ways. But with this series with Liz, we've finished our, what I called the Diversity in the Boardroom mini-series of 3 episodes, 3 fantastic women who've shared very practical tips and also shared their career journeys and their stories, their lessons learned along the way. Because I was sitting at a table recently and somebody shared, oh, diversity is so overdone and people keep talking about it, but no one's actually doing anything practical. And I agree that does happen a lot. So that's why with these 3 episodes, I wanted to say, yes, there's a lot of talking about things, but actually this hopefully just gives you an idea of all the things that we can actually be doing. And it all starts by giving the microphone, giving the space, and highlighting these women that really deserve to be in the spotlight. So that's why we're preparing something very, very exciting and slightly different going ahead with the next mini-series, which will wrap up this season. And that's going to be all about women business owners, women who've started their own business, women who have built successful businesses by doing something different and driven out of a motivation for something else, to make a difference, to work in a different way, to help. More and more of you are coming to me and asking me about how to find direction, what their next step should be, hesitating about whether they should finally leave that other job that's not giving them any inspiration, or they have some kind of conflict about what's happening inside, values not being aligned. And hopefully these stories will continue to inspire you and tell you absolutely yes, 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 you do need to do it. You do need to listen to that voice. Just stop ignoring it and go for it. So while the sound of breaking glass may be continuing to evolve and there are some very exciting changes coming along, I do really want to wrap up this season with a beautiful celebration of the women business owners, founders, and leaders, the ones who are actually making a difference. 3 very different profiles, but 3 profiles that I know you're going to love. So stay tuned. The new episodes are dropping in exactly 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of The Sound of Breaking Glass. I truly appreciate you being here with me. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss on any new episodes. They drop every 2 weeks. I'd also love for you to join me over on Instagram, on LinkedIn, where I share more behind-the-scenes moments, guest insights, and extra resources just for our amazing Breakers community. Let's keep the conversation going, and I can't wait to connect with you there. Until next time, take care and keep breaking through.